Dr. Peter Gleick, whose work I have admired for years since I was a graduate student. And I mentioned to him that our paths crossed a few times within the environmental security arena that I also work in. Peter has been inspirational because he has not only done so well in terms of his academic performance. He's got a PhD from Berkeley in energy and resources, and then went on to become a member of the National Academy of Sciences based on his academic credentials. But he's been an entrepreneur in terms of his willingness to not go the well-trodden path of the tenure track academic, and instead uh, established his own research institute, the Pacific Institute in Berkeley, that became really the leading think tank in water research. During the 80s, 90s, especially during the 90s, and flourished. And it really was able to find a niche that had been missing with reference to research on water that was independent, that was policy driven, practical. And for that work, he was also awarded the MacArthur Fellowship. So he's had these coveted accolades that most academics yearn for, and yet he has been able to be removed enough from academia to, I think, have a much greater impact as well. His latest book, which, and he's written several books as well before, but this one is really a magnum opus in terms of its coverage of the environmental history of water, and it has already received wide acclaim. I wanted to just read some endorsements. Of course, from the popular writing community, people like Bill McKibben and Elizabeth Colbert have written endorsements. Greta Thunberg has called it, "What a wonderful book." But then also, um, Science Magazine has reviewed it, Scientific American has reviewed it, Ralph Lauren Magazine has reviewed it, and it is really quite astonishing, the coverage that he's able to provide here. I'm not going to give away. I have read the book, and I wish he was with us in person so I could have had him autograph it. I do hope our paths will cross in person at some point. But it's really a book which it gives you this panoramic view about how water is so embedded in our geology, in our biology, in our sociology, and then, brings it all together with a very hopeful tone. And that is what I find so refreshing. As many of you know, I tend to be an environmental pragmatist of sorts. And what I found, especially in this book, that it's very hopeful. At the end also, which I won't give away, he comes forth with a very important lesson. And there's a quotation particularly in there, which I will perhaps share if he doesn't do it himself, that I found really very positive for our students to have in terms of how they see the visioning of their sustainability journey. So thank you so much, Peter, for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Professor Ali. It's been a delight to keep track of you and to talk to you today. And I wanted to thank you for helping to arrange this seminar. And also, of course, thanks to the University of Delaware's Friday Book Seminar program. As Professor Ali mentioned, I'm a scientist by training. I'm a hydrologist and climate scientist. I've worked for many, many years on the intersection of climate and water, water and conflict, water and sustainability. My institute, the Pacific Institute in Oakland, California, addresses these global water issues from both a science and a policy perspective. And we work on basically all aspects of fresh water, which of course is such a huge topic. Let me start by saying that I think we're living in a remarkable time, a time when we're in a transition from the many water-related crises that are out there to a positive, sustainable future. And that was really the reasoning behind my writing of this book. The book is called The Three Ages of Water. I'll talk about the three ages as I make this presentation, but the subtitle of the book is Prehistoric Past, Imperiled Present, and a Hope for the Future. And again, as Professor Ali mentioned, the book is a positive vision. It talks about the crises, the water crises that we face, but it also talks about my sense that we can move toward a positive, sustainable vision. And that's what I'll talk about today. So let me share my screen here. I have some slides to share with everyone. So I hope that you can see this. I also hope that we don't have any subtitles. I hope that that's working out okay. So let me start by asking, what do we really know about water? What is it? Where does it come from? What role has it played in the history of Earth, or indeed the cosmos, or in the evolution and development of humanity? What can history and science and experience tell us about the potential to solve our water problems and to move to this idea of a sustainable future? And that's what this book is about. That's what this story is about. Science tells us that the very first hydrogen atoms were likely formed merely minutes, maybe a few thousand years after the Big Bang. Oxygen took a little bit longer. The first stars had to form, they exploded, they created and spread oxygen into the expanding universe. But once we had hydrogen and oxygen, we had water. And science also tells us that water is ubiquitous throughout the universe. Everywhere we look, we see it. It's on other planets and on moons in our own solar system and beyond, in asteroids and comets, in interstellar space, throughout the Milky Way, and in other galaxies. The truth is, when we look out into the universe, we see water everywhere. Ice has been found in deep craters on Mercury, very close to the sun, protected from the blazing heat of the sun. Water or water molecules have been seen in the blistering atmosphere of Venus, in ice and snow and groundwater on Mars, in craters on our own moon. The frozen planets of Uranus and Neptune, which are relatively small, have more water on them than is here on Earth. Just a short time ago, a couple of months ago, in a remarkable technological feat, India landed a rover on the moon, and India chose the place to land the rover near the South Pole, where we know there is water ice. And where there's water ice, we can create oxygen, we can create fuel, we can perhaps maintain human existence outside of our own planet. Earlier this year, the new space telescope returned images confirming the venting of water from the surface of Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, which may actually have all of the elements necessary for life. And in fact, the water that's venting from Enceladus creates one of the rings around Saturn, another example of the presence of water in our own solar system. And science tells us that without water, there would be no life. Maybe. We only have one example to choose from, of course, but certainly without water, you or I, or life as we know it, wouldn't exist. And so the story of water and the history of humanity are entangled in what I call the three ages of water, from our early beginnings to our modern day to the dystopian or sustainable future that's coming. So in my book, The First Age of Water encompasses the billions of years from the Big Bang to the formation of our planet, to the ultimate evolution of Homo sapiens and the earliest cultures and empires. As early species of hominins, that's the family that includes our own, evolved in Africa millions of years ago, the presence and absence of water and the variations of climatic conditions over time were key to the success or failure of our many different ancestors. In these early years, human populations expanded from thousands to the first millions, and then spread over the continents to Egypt and to Mesopotamia, the floodplains of the Indus Valley in Asia, along the great rivers in China, to Australia, and ultimately to the vast rainforests and grasslands and savannas of the Americas. And these early populations of Homo sapiens, first of all, succeeded because of their ability to manipulate the hydrologic cycle, their ability to deal with extremes of climate and extremes of water. And then these early populations created writing and religion and invented agriculture and formed the first empires that began to manipulate the world and the water around them, building the first dams and aqueducts. This is an image of the Sad el Kafara Dam in Egypt that was built around 2700 BCE. And we actually have evidence of even older dams and aqueducts that were built in the ancient Middle East to try and manage and manipulate the water resources around them. This was a period of time when early humans invented intentional agriculture, intentional irrigation. We created the first water laws and the first water institutions, and we fought the first wars over water, a war over water that occurred around 2400 BC in ancient Mesopotamia between two city-states of Sumeria, fighting over irrigated water between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. I live in California in the Western United States today. We have a classic joke that while we may run out of water, we'll never run out of water lawyers. But the ancient Sumerians had water lawyers also. The oldest known legal code is the Code of Urnamu, dated to around 2100 BC, uncovered in cuneiform tablets found in the ruins of a Sumerian city that had rules for managing water. And a few centuries after that, the more famous Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was an ancient leader of Babylon, had a set of laws that also included laws around water. And one of those laws states, quote, if a man fails to maintain his levees and reservoirs in proper condition, and the levee fails, and all the fields be flooded and the crops carried away, then the man whose levee failed shall repay the damaged grain. Again, one of the earliest laws about how to manage our irrigated agriculture, about rules of responsibility for maintaining irrigation systems and agricultural systems. In a sense, this was one of the earliest forms of agricultural crop insurance. But ultimately, the first age of water came to an end when rising populations and expanding cities and growing pressures on natural resources demanded that we create a new relationship with water. And the answer to the challenges were to be found in the science and the engineering and the cultural and philosophical blossomings of civilization that defined what I call the second age of water. The second age of water is our age. It's when we learned how to manipulate the natural hydrologic cycle for our benefit. It encompasses the hydrologic marvels built by the ancient Greeks and the Romans, an ancient aqueduct here that permitted the Romans to move water hundreds of kilometers purely with the force of gravity. We unlocked the biological and chemical and physical properties of water. We understood for the first time what oxygen and hydrogen really were, what water really was. We created the machines and the tools and the institutions to take advantage of our new scientific understandings. This is images from Leonardo da Vinci's drawings and writings that talk about some of the early machines in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s that we developed to manage and manipulate water resources. It was a period of time when we had the tools and the institutions to take advantage of our new scientific understandings and to build the first dams, not out of rock and stone, but out of concrete and steel, to hold back floodwaters, to store water in dry periods, to produce clean, reliable electricity. This is Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado River. And ultimately, we replumbed the entire planet. We learned about germs and diseases. We learned that cholera was not an airborne disease or a food-related disease, but it was a water-related disease. And we learned about the links to dirty water, the connections between dirty water and human health. And then we learned how to build the water treatment plants that provide safe water for cities, for millions of people, and collect and treat our wastewater. We built aqueducts not tens of kilometers long or even hundreds of kilometers long, dug out of dirt and stone like our Mesopotamian and Roman ancestors, but thousands of kilometers long through or over mountains. We pumped groundwater from deep underground so that farmers could grow food in places and at times never before possible. The Green Revolution that many of us know about, the revolution that permitted us to grow enough food to support billions of people, was as much, in my opinion, a revolution of irrigation technology and our ability to pump groundwater as anything else. And in this second age of water, we began casting our eyes and our instruments outward to other planets looking for water and evidence that we're not alone in the universe. So modern civilization is built on the advances of the second age, and we've all benefited from those advances in countless ways. We mostly live longer and healthier lives. We're mostly richer economically, socially, and culturally. And mostly we take for granted the advances of the second age of water. But we're now also facing adverse unintended consequences of these advances. By the middle of the 20th century, we started to see and understand the first evidence of the loss of nature, the rise of environmental problems as the Industrial Revolution accelerated and populations grew exponentially. We saw the first world wars. We've started to see skyrocketing pressure on natural resources. In the 20th century, during the 1900s, rivers and lakes treated as dumps for our wastes began to catch fire and die. This is a photograph from when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire in 1952. But it was actually an event in 1968 when the Cuyahoga River caught fire, in 1969, that really captured the imagination of the American public. And there are no photographs from that 1969 fire, but the Cuyahoga River had caught fire many times before that because of the industrial wastes that we had dumped into our rivers. But this event in 1969 and a big oil spill off the California coast that contaminated the coast of California helped push the environmental movement in the late 60s and early 70s. That environmental movement led to the Clean Water Act in the United States. It led to the Safe Drinking Water Act in the United States. And it was a symptom of part of the challenges of the second age of water with water pollution. But despite advances in water quality protections, we know that serious water quality problems still remain. We have serious problems with plastic pollutions. We have serious problems with algal outbreaks that are a function of some of the agricultural chemicals that we continue to dump into our waterways. It's a symptom of climate change, which I'll come back to in a moment, and rising temperatures that have accelerated outbreaks of these toxic algal pollutions. We now understand the causes of water-related diseases and how to prevent them, but they persist, including new illnesses associated with pollutants like mercury, lead, pesticides, and complex agricultural and industrial chemicals that are not adequately regulated, even in a place like Europe or the United States. And in perhaps the worst consequence, in my opinion, the worst failure of the second age of water, we have failed to provide safe water and sanitation for literally billions of people around the world, including here in our own country, a problem I call water poverty. Many of you may know the stories of Flint, Michigan, and Jackson, Mississippi, where mismanagement and underinvestment in water systems led to contamination, the loss of safe water for hundreds of thousands of people, mostly in poor frontline communities in the United States, but hundreds of thousands of more people in rural communities, in farm worker towns in California's Central Valley, and Native American communities and reservations that don't have, and some have never had, access to safe water or flush toilets or reliable supplies. So this concept of water poverty, where billions of people worldwide don't have access to safe water and sanitation, is a problem even here in the richer developed nations of the world. We're also seeing increasing violence associated with competition or access or control of freshwater resources. One of the things I do at the Pacific Institute is I maintain something called the Water Conflict Chronology. If you're interested in water and national security issues, water and environmental politics, water and conflict, Google Water Conflict Chronology. It'll give you access to this open source database. And just recently, about a week and a half ago, we released a major update of that conflict chronology. It now has over 1,600 entries where water has been used as a trigger or a weapon or a casualty of conflict, going back to that very first event in 2400 BC in ancient Sumeria. But this is a graph that shows just over the last couple of decades, both the number of conflict events and the type of conflict events. And it shows two things. It shows a big increase in the number of events where water has been a trigger or a weapon or a casualty of conflict over time. And it shows the breakdown of those three categories: trigger, weapon, and casualty. Again, this doesn't show the most recent update. 2022 actually has a greater number of events than any of these, showing how it's increased over time. And the last few years have shown, in particular, big events, large number of events in the Ukraine, where water systems and dams have been attacked, in the Middle East and in Israel and Palestine, where water and water systems have been targets and casualties of conflict. We're seeing peak water limits being reached as rivers run dry, as aquifers are depleted, as ecosystems are destroyed. As much as 30% of global food production today comes from unsustainable use of groundwater, overdraft of groundwater. We're strip mining the land of forests, the oceans of fish. We're driving uncounted species of plants and animals to extinction. And some of the worst ecological problems of the second age of water are threats to aquatic ecosystems because of our abuse and mismanagement of water resources. And perhaps most worrisome to the future of water resources, and potentially humanity, is climate change. We know that climate's changing. As the 20th century ended, scientists found irrefutable scientific evidence that the combustion of fossil fuels and the destruction of forests are altering the very climate of the planet, with accelerating impacts on every community and for every natural resource, especially water resources. Changing flood risks and drought risks, melting ice caps, glaciers, and snow in the mountains, accelerating wildfires, increasing the demand for water needed to grow food, and damaging aquatic ecosystems. And of course, as I'm sure all of you know, today, this week, COP28 is happening in Dubai, just the latest international effort to address some of the challenges of water, of climate change, and in particular, water. There's a whole water pavilion now at COP28, something that only started recently, to help us understand and address the challenges of climate change for water resources. In short, the end of the second age of water is a race between the growing risk of ecological collapse, massive economic inequality worldwide, and political and military conflict, and the growing efforts to apply our hard-earned knowledge and technologies to prevent global disaster. It's time to both acknowledge the benefits of this second age of water and the need to make a transition to a third age where we address the growing failures surrounding us, where we make the technological and social transition to sustainability. That transition won't be easy, but it's both necessary and possible. I would like to argue that two paths lie before us: one to a dystopian future, the other to a positive, sustainable future. And just as we can imagine a disastrous future, and we see it all the time in the literature and public media and social media and public commentary, just as we can imagine that disastrous future, we can imagine a positive one. And just as our actions can lead us to that bad future, they can also lead us to a better future with a balance between humans and nature, with growing equality and social cohesion, with healthy, stable, and sustainable societies. And that's the future I focus on in the third age of water. I believe that this positive vision is possible and achievable. In fact, I believe this transition is already underway. We're learning how to weave together a tapestry of actions and decisions and policies of individuals, communities, corporations, countries around the world, sometimes in surprising places and surprising ways, to address these unresolved water problems of the second age of water. We know how to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone on the planet. And the UN has set a goal of doing so by 2030. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. They address a wide range of global sustainability challenges. But one of them, SDG 6, is the water goal. And one of the targets of SDG 6 is to provide everyone on the planet with safe water and sanitation by 2030. I don't think we'll meet that target date, but I know we can, and I believe that we'll meet it eventually. We don't need new technology. The costs of providing safe water and sanitation to everyone on the planet are far less than the costs of failing to do so, costs mostly borne by women and children, and mostly borne in the form of water-related diseases and lost economic opportunity. We know how to provide water, how to use water more productively and efficiently to do the things we want, including growing more food with less water, changing our diets to cut our water footprints, providing clean clothes and with less water. There are ways of doing what we want with far less water than we currently spend to do those things. We know how to grow more food with less water, with smarter irrigation systems, and we're beginning to do that worldwide. And in one of the most remarkable examples of the evidence that we're in this transition already, here is a graph that shows today in the United States a couple of different things. It shows the red line is the US gross domestic product, that measure that economists love to see of ever increasing economic output. But it also shows total water withdrawals from the year 1900 up to the year 2015 for everything that we do: water for irrigation, water for power plant cooling, water for all of our domestic and industrial and commercial needs. And what it shows is that those curves grew together, as we've all been taught to assume that they would do, up until about the mid-1970s, when those two curves split apart and our economic metrics continued to grow, but total water withdrawals in the United States are less today than they were 40 or 50 years ago. And on a per capita basis, total per capita water use is far less than it used to be 40 or 50 years ago. This is an example of our ability to do what we want, to continue to grow our economy, to continue to grow our populations while using less water. It's an example of improving efficiency, about changing the nature of our economic system and our industrial system, and it's a remarkable success story. The other thing to think about with this graph, if those two curves had continued to grow together, and that blue line was up where that red line is, the United States would have had to more than double water withdrawals over that time. And I can't tell you where that water would have come from. We already overdraft our groundwater aquifers. We already use all of the water in the Colorado River and many other Western rivers. We would not have been able to do that. And this is another example of the fact that I think we're in this transition to a different future. We know how to clean up and reuse the most contaminated wastewater. This is another example of this transition away from finding more sources of supply that require taking more water out of our ecosystems, but instead collecting and treating and reusing our wastewater. And we know how to clean up and reuse the most contaminated wastewater. We do this on the space station, the International Space Station. They recycle and reuse more than 95% of their wastewater because water is very expensive to launch into outer space. Israel and Singapore today recycle and reuse nearly all of their treated wastewater. California reuses about 18%, but hopes to triple that in the coming years. We also know how to produce fresh water from salt water. 97% of the water on the planet is salt water in the oceans, but we know how to desalinate seawater. We're doing that in places where we've become more efficient, where the economics permit. More and more places are turning to desalination as a last resort. It's expensive, it has environmental liabilities, but we know how to desalinate seawater. We're learning how to restore and protect natural ecosystems that have suffered from our past abuse, including guaranteeing water for ecosystems and removing damaging dams and restoring free-flowing rivers. This is an image of something called the Elwha Dam on the Elwha River in the Pacific Northwest. It was a very large dam built at the time in the early 1900s for a little bit of power and for water supply for some lumber mills. But a few years ago, that dam was removed. And this is what that site looks like today. The river is being restored. Salmon are now breeding tens of miles upstream of where the dam site was. And this year, the world's largest dam removal project and river restoration project is underway on the Klamath River on the California and Oregon border. Overall, 1,000 dams have been removed in the United States, mostly very small, mostly uneconomic or very dangerous or ecologically damaging dams, but bigger and bigger dams are coming down as we try to restore rivers around the world. We're slowly coming to grips with the need to resolve disputes over water peacefully and diplomatically rather than with violence. So the coming years will determine how we choose to make this transition to the third age, whether we slip down into a grim and dismal future or solve the water crises that afflict us and make the shift to a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. As I said earlier, I'm convinced that a positive future is both possible and underway. I've worked with individuals and communities and corporations and countries to begin to put in place solutions to our water problems. There are no insurmountable technological or economic roadblocks to a positive third age of water. But whether we can overcome the political, social, institutional, and cultural obstacles that remain depends on the choices we make and on how quickly we act. So, in closing, let me read a few sentences from the last section of my book. I believe that a positive future in the third age of water is not only possible, but inevitable. Indeed, this optimism is what has permitted me to continue working on the critical global challenges of climate, water, and sustainability. Perhaps that's because the alternatives, the dystopian visions of our sci-fi novels and apocalyptic movies and pessimistic doomsayers, are simply too depressing for me to accept. It would be a cosmic shame if, alone in this small corner of the universe, our spark of intelligent life was not quite intelligent enough to overcome the challenges of living on a finite, delicate planet and fell back into the dark ages of chaos, or worse, went the way of the dinosaurs. That's possible, but it needn't be that way. If we fail to achieve the positive future for water, it won't be because it can't. It will be because we didn't. The hopeful vision of water that I offer here in this book is achievable and reachable, and pieces of it are already apparent in innovative, successful efforts underway around the world. It's a future worth fighting for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gleick. That was phenomenal. And you did use the quote that I was going to note. And let me perhaps provide a friendly challenge on that use of the word inevitable, because I know you are, very thoughtful about your choice of words. And I'm wondering, would the word inevitable apply specifically to water because of its characteristics as being an essential source for life, that people are eventually going to come around to figuring out how do we cooperate over it or find some resources? Or is there something else going on? Because the use of the word inevitable brings forth, of course, the kind of moral hazard problems, as you well know, in environmental discourse that we always warn our students about.
Well, so I use it inevitable because I think it's inevitable. I think we will solve these problems, but I don't by any means mean to underestimate the challenges that we still face and the bad things that are happening now and are going to continue to happen as we move into this transition. I don't know when we'll provide 100% of the planet with safe water and sanitation. I know that we can, and I really do believe that we will. I know that we're seeing an uptick in conflict over water resources, but I also know that there's growing awareness of that issue and growing efforts to figure out how to share water diplomatically and growing efforts to bring together some of the political tools to address those problems. Climate
Indeed.
change, I'm a climate scientist by training. I know how severe the climate problem is and is going to continue to be for a long time. But I also believe that ultimately we will see a transition away from fossil fuels, and we will slowly move to a more sustainable energy system. Again, we're seeing an acceleration of that now, and it gives me some hope. I just hope that we can figure out a way to make this transition happen faster. Ultimately, I believe that the population of the planet is going to turn down, and it will be ultimately easier to solve some of these problems for a smaller population than for a larger population. Again, I think it's inevitable, but I don't know when it will happen and the bad things that will happen between here and there. That's the challenge that we face to make it happen faster.
Indeed, yeah, we certainly wouldn't want a dystopian path to utopia. So, but also the other, maybe if I'm, and certainly please feel free to start thinking about questions, audience members, and you're welcome to also put them in the chat. But you mentioned in the book, that there's the second age was more the hard path, and then the third would be more the soft path, and the soft path is more institutional, and as you were noting, more about social innovations and so on. But at this so in terms of what is happening with international environmental politics, where it seems that the soft path in terms of environmental action is still low politics. The high politics of war and peace still tend to trump, pardon the use of the word in that regard, multiple connotations, but they just do not seem to get to that level of salience. So how would you, like, if you think about even the Ukraine war, um, the amount of resource usage and so on that has been going on around it has uh, has the environmental sort of aspiration been sort of sidelined in this institutional dynamic still, and still you are
Yeah,
hopeful.
yeah. So maybe for people listening, just a quick background. I've written extensively about what I call the soft path for water, which is a more sustainable approach to dealing with water. The hard path was the hard infrastructure, the focus on supply, always finding more and more supply to meet this assumption, which I think is no longer true, of inevitable increases in demand for water. Uh, the hard path was also a period of time when we didn't understand or we didn't know about the environmental consequences of all of the decisions we were making about how we manage our water resources. And the soft path is a more complex way of thinking about water. It includes rethinking supply, the idea that supply doesn't require taking water out of ecosystems, but includes recycling and reusing water. The idea that it's not just supply, but it's demand. That if we can think about efficiency and conservation and what we really want to do, we can figure out how to do what we want with less water, grow more food with less water, wash our clothes and dishes with less water, flush our toilets with less water. And that's the efficiency revolution that I talked briefly about and that I believe is underway. But the soft path also includes rethinking economics. How do we price and subsidize and treat water in an economic sense? How do we integrate the human right to water with our economic approaches for water? And maybe most relevant for your comment, how do we rethink our institutions? Water is often a local issue. It's not a national issue or a global issue. It has to be addressed at the local scale. There are things that we have to do at the global scale. Global diplomacy is a good example. The Ukraine war and figuring out how to really prevent attacks on water systems that aren't water wars, but where water is a casualty or a target of
Mhm.
conflicts that start for whatever reasons. And we've seen that in the Middle East. We've seen it in the Ukraine. That's a challenge for global institutions. And there are national applications of changes in institutions that we have to deal with as well. Water is a multi-level issue. And I think part of the third age of water is going to be rethinking our institutions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. On the Ukraine war, I should mention one of our PhD students, Mehmet Eltengos, who has graduated now. He works for the Turkish government, but he did an analysis which suggested also that the current invasion of Ukraine, it can be in some ways linked to the Dnieper River's water, which was cut off when Crimea was initially invaded in 2014. So the Ukrainians cut off the water, and Crimea was completely dependent on that canal. And then, Russia actually took Ukraine to the European court to try and get this, changed and so on. But and Putin has used that as a justification in some ways. So it's interesting, even in that context where water is playing out. Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. We have, yes,
Just a
sir.
quick comment on that. With several colleagues in Europe and the Ukraine, I've written several papers, peer-reviewed journal articles about the Ukraine war, about
Mhm.
attacks on water systems, about the role that water has played, documenting some of that. In the new update to the water conflict chronology, there are a whole new set of entries from that Ukraine war. In 2022, there were 43 events in the new
Wow.
database where water or water systems have been attacked, where dams have been attacked. Um, in the very opening days in 2022 of the war, one of the first things Russia did was they destroyed the little dam on
Yes,
the
yeah.
Crimea
On the
Canal, the North
canal, yeah.
Crimea Canal, to
Yeah,
try and restore
perfectly.
water. So it definitely has, it was not the cause of the war, but it has
No, no.
certainly played a role.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Okay, let's have questions then from the floor. Gabriela, and please introduce yourself to.
Yes, hello, I'm Gabriela Mundaka. I'm affiliated to the Department of Geography. Thank you very much for the. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation on the book. I have just a small question here, and how do you think we can help the developing world and really be able to have access to water, to cover the basic needs? Even not even talking about agriculture, but just the basic needs. In other words, the SDG goal.
Yeah.
They have a lot of, they don't have access to good institutions or good technology. So how do we help them? How do you think about this?
Well, so as I've said many times in talks I've given, and I really believe the worst problem we face, the worst failure of the second age, is the failure to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone on the planet. It's appalling that we have failed to do that. We don't need to invent any new technology. We don't need more money than is available. We spend far more money on far less important things worldwide. How we do it, though, is a complicated institutional question. The failure to provide safe water and sanitation is largely, I would argue, an institutional issue. It's partly an issue of getting resources to the right places. It's helping countries that have failed to do that, either develop the institutions or to get access to the resources to do that. And I think we're learning better ways of doing it. The pace is accelerated. In the old days, the idea was some good-meaning NGO would go in and drill a well in a developing country, and then they would leave, and the technology would fail because it wasn't a project that was developed with a local community in charge or with the understanding of the local conditions. And so we've learned, I think, from some of the failures, but we need to accelerate that. And it's a responsibility of governments. It's a responsibility of local communities. It's a responsibility of non-governmental organizations. There are a lot of ways we need to do it. But I really do believe the resources are there, and we just need to accelerate all of those efforts.
Great. Well, we have two questions. We have in the audience both the Delaware State climatologist and the Delaware State geologist, and both have questions. So first, we'll go to Dan Leathers, whose questions in the chat, who's the state climatologist, and he says, "Has your institute been studying changes in the timing of water within the annual cycle? I'm thinking about things like changes in snow cover variability. How much does this add to overall water availability?"
Yes, so we and many, many others have done a lot of work on the impacts of climate change on water resources. There's a whole section in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, reports focused on water. In the new U.S. National Assessment, just released a few weeks ago, there's a whole section on impacts on the hydrologic cycle on water resources. We're seeing, of course, very significant changes in snowfall and snowmelt dynamics. We're seeing less snow and more rain in the mountainous regions of the Western United States. We're seeing more extreme droughts and more extreme flooding, both in many different parts of the world. In the northeastern part of the United States, we're not seeing a change in the total amount of precipitation, but we're seeing a change in the intensity of precipitation events. We're seeing more water coming down in shorter periods of time. Another example that has long been predicted from climate models that we're now seeing in observation. So there's a tremendous amount of both modeling information about what to expect, but also increasingly observational evidence about how the hydrologic cycle is being affected by changes in the climate.
And Dan, did you have anything more specific with reference to your own expertise? I should mention also, Peter, that we have a PhD program both in geography and a separate one in climatology also. So we have quite a few climatology people, and several who have contributed to the assessment too. So Dan, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a fine answer. I was just interested to know if that was something that your institute, especially given where you are, has a great interest in, and just what your opinion was on how much the interseasonal changes are important compared to overall water quantity and water availability.
Yeah, so the Institute is mostly focused in this area on impacts in the Western United States. I've done some work in Egypt on the Nile Basin. Much of our focus has looked at the timing of water availability in California, for example, changes in atmospheric river dynamics that bring water to California in the rainy season. In particular, changes in snowfall and snowmelt dynamics and changes in the timing of runoff in California, changes in drought frequency and intensity in the Western United States. We do a lot of work in the Colorado River Basin as well, and we've already seen evidence that climate change is changing both the total amount of water that's available in the Colorado Basin and the timing of the flows because of changes in the dynamics in mountain snowfall and snowmelt. Those are some of the things that we focused on at the Institute.
Okay, yeah, thanks very
Okay,
much.
great, thank you. And now we move to our state geologist, David Wunsch, okay, with his question.
Hello, Peter.
Hey, David.
We may have crossed paths in the past too. I have not read your book yet, but I was wondering if you do address the water energy nexus. That's a real important part with, especially as we're getting into the third age, as you defined it in your book. But when you showed the picture of the dam removal, I think of immediately, of course, it opens up the stream for ecological reasons, but you're also losing a good source of base energy load. And you've got other things, for example, the RO reverse osmosis plant you showed there, a lot of times those are located near nuclear plants where they're getting co-generated energy to use. And so even if we're not using more water, where you showed some of the conservation processes have kept our demand flat, there's also a competition for our energy now as we get more electric vehicles and we're taking away baseload power of coal and nuclear and expecting solar and wind and other renewables to pick up that slack. Another article I just read today was a report that came out about the snowstorm and its effect last year in the Northeast, where they came very close to blackouts because the cold weather was freezing up the gas lines. There was not enough natural gas for the energy production, which everybody has gone to. So anyway, I was just wondering, how do you weave that into this transition to the third age, because there's going to be a competition for energy. Just another one off the top of my head is, as groundwater levels get deeper, as we know, we're mining water that takes a lot more energy to draw that out with pumps as the the head increase.
Yeah. So
Anyway,
David, great
thoughts?
question. I've done a lot of work over the years on the water energy links. I wrote a paper for annual reviews of energy and a number of journal articles about water energy connections. And they're very strong. It takes a tremendous amount of water to produce the energy that we require, and takes a tremendous amount of energy to collect and treat and move and use our water resources as well. I actually think there's some good news on this front. I showed that graph about GNP and total US water withdrawals. Another reason why total water withdrawals in the United States are actually turning down is because we're shifting away from fossil fuels. And it turns out that fossil fuel power plants and nuclear power plants, thermal power plants in general, are a tremendous user of water. They withdraw a tremendous amount of water for power plant cooling. And that water's not consumed. It typically goes back in the river a few minutes later and it's hotter. And that's sometimes an ecological problem in terms of the amount or the temperature. But as we shift to renewables, the amount of water required to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity is dropping tremendously. It's actually a tremendous benefit of the shift to renewables. It's reducing our water demands for the energy system. In addition, we're beginning to figure out ways to use water more, to use energy more efficiently to do the water things that we want. Anything that we do that uses water more efficiently, our dishwashers, our washing machines that often require a third or less of the water that the old technology used, also requires less energy, both to run the machines, but also to produce the hot water that's required. So there are lots of different connections between water and energy. I talk about it a little bit in the book. There's a lot of work that's been done on that, and I think it's going to continue to be a big issue.
Great. And we had one of our earlier speakers in the book seminar series wrote a book about the use of water in fracking, and also the Ogallala aquifers depletion. We had one of the authors whose book was in the finalist for the National Book Award, and he's a professor at University of Oklahoma. He also spoke about, so it's really interesting that with this water energy nexus has been a recurring theme. All right,
Actually,
wonderful.
Salim, let me say one more thing about that, because
Yes.
I didn't address the groundwater issue that David asked. I actually just gave a talk in Kansas and learned quite a bit about what's going on in up to date in the Ogallala aquifer. Of course, they have a tremendous groundwater overdraft problem, but they're doing some very innovative things in Kansas, in some of the water districts, to try and grow more food with less water and reduce the energy required to pump groundwater to produce the food that we need. So they're aware of the groundwater overdraft problem in many parts of the world. They're trying to address them. Reducing groundwater overdraft will help reduce some of the energy demand to produce that groundwater, to produce the food that we require as well. It's a difficult challenge. A lot of, as I said, I think in my introductory remarks, a lot of the world's food production comes from overdrafted groundwater. That's going to be one of the big challenges moving forward.
Indeed, indeed. Very good. So next question is from Del Levia, who is an eco-hydrologist and past chair of the department. Del, over to
Hi,
you.
Peter. Thank you for the very informative talk. I really enjoyed it. And I also want to thank you, but maybe it's about 10 years ago, I read your book, Bottled and Sold. And I used it in some of my classes, and it really resonated with students as a wonderful book.
Thank you.
So just wanted to let you know that. But my question for today's talk was, you had the one slide, it was from 2000 to 2021 of water conflicts, and whether it's used as a trigger, a weapon,
Right.
or and what the source is. My question is, maybe can you give me a sense of what happened before 2000? Because I'm thinking, a lot of populations, when they initially settled, they settled along waterways, and as populations grew, of course, we got more sophisticated in the second water age, as you said. But I'm just wondering if it might have been smaller skirmishes or things of that nature, but were there more peaks into the proportion of the trigger versus the water as the initiation of the conflict, the weapon? Has that changed over time? Because I noticed the uptick, as you said, but I'm just curious about what happened earlier.
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the reasons we only typically show data from about 2000 to the present day is because we're much better now at getting information about conflicts over water. It's harder to get good data from as you go back farther and farther in time. There's this one entry from 2400 BC about this war between Umma and Lagash in ancient Sumeria. I suspect that there were many other conflicts over water resources, but that's the only one that we know of because it was literally carved in stone, and archaeologists found the evidence for it. We have more and more data today. If there's a conflict over water, my phone buzzes because I've set up a system to get information right away about it. And so that's why we show mostly more recent data. And so it's a little hard to say if the trend between water as a trigger, which is, fights over access and control of water resources, or whether water was used as a weapon, for example, releasing water from a dam during a conflict, or withholding water from a population, or whether water is a casualty where water systems were attacked during conflicts that start for what other reason were more or less prevalent. So it's a little hard for me to say. In recent years, we've seen a lot of data where water is a casualty of conflicts, mostly where urban water systems or dams or civilian infrastructure has been attacked in the West Bank, in the Ukraine, in Yemen, especially in the war in Yemen that occurred in the early 2010s. So a better analysis probably of some of those trends is worth doing.
Great, thank you. And we've also got a question from Miriam Axel, who wrote your review in Science, and she's joined us through the United Nations University connection. So Miriam, you're welcome to ask it on the floor if you like, but she's also written the question in the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed the talk. Yeah, I guess I was wondering if you could talk about the issue of justice and the historic responsibility of developed countries who have had this access to water, and how can we account for, is there a parallel with responsibility for historic emissions and pollution, and how can developed countries help support and account for these historical inequities in supporting water access for countries in the global South?
Yeah, thank you. It's another great question. There is a section in the book about the human right to water, as you know, because I know you've read the book, but as others may know, there was a long debate about the human right to water. Is there a human right to water? In the original human rights documents, they were mostly focused on political and economic rights. Water wasn't originally mentioned, but in 2010, after again extensive debate, the UN declared a formal human right to water. That's been used as an argument for helping expand access to safe water and sanitation worldwide. It's not by itself, the declaration of the human right to water by itself is not going to be enough, of course, to provide safe water and sanitation to everyone. As for whose responsibility it is, that's sort of a hard question. The failure to provide safe water in some developing countries is a failure of national institutions in those countries. Either they're state failures themselves, or they have other responsibilities they have to deal with. They have to deal with communications and education and transportation and human health issues and water. And they're just not either institutionally or economically able to do all the things that we know need to be done. All of the sustainable development goals, not just water. One of the things the developed world can do is help provide economic resources. It can help provide technology. It can help provide institutional abilities to improve management systems that can provide safe water and sanitation. I do think there is a responsibility of those of us who have benefited from the advances of the second age of water to help the rest of the world benefit from those advances and to perhaps avoid some of the adverse consequences of the second age of water. I'm not a fan of big dams and big infrastructure, but I don't say that we shouldn't be building more dams. There are places around the world where more big concrete infrastructure is needed, where more centralized wastewater treatment systems are needed. But maybe we could also help developing countries build decentralized wastewater systems that we're now starting to build that would help prevent some of the big capital investments that are required, help avoid some of those big economic challenges that we know are out there. So I think there are a lot of paths forward for that.
Great. So I would also encourage our students to use this very valuable opportunity to ask questions. We have several students who work in areas related to water. But as they're thinking through their questions, one additional question I had was around, it's related to Miriam's question, but where there has been this United Nations effort around a treaty on fresh water, there's a European, UN Economic Commission for Europe agreement on transboundary waters. What is your view of these sort of soft law, or soft law in a very problematic way, perhaps, because they're not enforceable? But you have said soft paths are good in other ways. So what are your thoughts on these efforts?
Well, so I have mixed feelings about that. I'm a big fan of the efforts of the United Nations. The United Nations is a good example of an institution where water changes in the institutions are required. Water is addressed by the Food and Agricultural Organization. It's addressed by by the World Health Organization. It's addressed by many different UN agencies. But the UN has put together something called UN Water, which is an attempt to bring all the different responsibilities for water in the UN under one system. And I think they're relatively effective. I'm also a fan of soft legal strategies. The problem with them, of course, is they're not enforceable, or they're not enforced often, but they do set standards and principles for how we ought to manage water resources. Some of the political agreements at the UN about shared international water courses, again, are not necessarily enforceable, but they have laid out standards for how countries ought to be sharing rivers that cross political boundaries. The Tigris and the Euphrates is shared by Turkey and Syria and Iraq and Iran, and there's no formal agreement among all of those countries about how to share the Tigris and the Euphrates, but the UN has laid out standards for equitable sharing, for data sharing, for conflict resolution, and the extent to which those principles can then be applied by country treaties themselves is at least a step forward. And I would like to see more of those kinds of institutional arrangements made. You know, ultimately, there are a lot of rivers that cross political boundaries. It's more than 200, maybe 300 rivers that cross political boundaries. And most of those rivers don't have agreements. But the countries that share those rivers have a responsibility to negotiate those agreements, to develop strategies for sharing equitably the water resources, for developing the organizations for conflict resolution. You know, we have a treaty with Mexico, and the United States signed a treaty with Mexico in 1944 over the Colorado River, and it has a mechanism for dispute resolution. And that's been relatively effective. And I would like to see more of that.
Indeed, I'm originally from Pakistan, and we have, of course, the Indus Waters Treaty, which has a dispute resolution system. But currently, the challenge is, the treaty was framed not as an ecologically based treaty. It was you divide the river in between the two countries. The World Bank was set up as an arbitrator. That's so. In terms of the way these treaties are put forward, do you think there is a room for having more of an ecosystem approach to treaties, which is not there right now? I don't think there are treaties which have that kind of a mandate, even though there's like the Ramsar Convention on wetlands, and we have like the Indus Delta is a very important wetland on the Pakistani side. It's actually designated a Ramsar site, but there's very little cooperation with India as part of the treaty on it because there's no ecological mandate. And in fact, there's a territorial dispute right in the middle of the delta, which is a ridiculous dispute. It says, should the boundary be between the two countries in the middle of the channel or on the side of the channel? And of course, in a delta, the channel is always moving. So so what are your thoughts on sort of ecological approach to these treaties?
Well, so that's a hard one. The first thing to do is put in place the systems and the institutions to at least have cooperation at the international level about shared water resources. We're behind the curve, as I've said, about restoring ecosystems. In the 20th century, we didn't care. We didn't understand what we were doing to them. We do have a growing understanding of the consequences of our water policies and decisions and institutions and technologies for ecosystems. And we're starting to deal with the cross-political issues. So the Klamath River dams, that's shared by California and Oregon. We had to come to an agreement between the two states about the ecological restoration of the Klamath River. The Colorado River Treaty didn't have anything in its agreement initially about ecosystems, but over the last few years, there's been an agreement between the US and Mexico about trying to restore ecological flows to the Delta in Mexico. We use the entire flow of the Colorado in a normal year. No water reaches the Delta, but we're starting to think about how to restore ecological flows to the Delta in Mexico, which requires changes in the United States in the way we use and deliver water. So there's an international agreement that's beginning to address some of the ecological challenges. There's a growing discussion about biological diversity conventions that will help address some of these issues, but a lot more work is needed.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, the students, any other questions? I know that there are a couple of students who were particularly keen to connect with you. Amir, you are here and you have followed Dr. Gleick's work. Are you there? Yeah, there you are. Any
I hope so.
question?
The third age of water is your age.
Yeah, exactly. So, Amir, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Dr. Gleick, and thank you for coming to this meeting. I had a question about the conflict between countries you mentioned, especially in Middle East. We have the conflict between Iran and Turkey, Iraq, Turkey, and Afghanistan, Iran.
Right.
Those conflicts, you mentioned to soft solution, but during the past years, what I've seen and the experiences showed that it's not very easy to solve this kind of conflicts. And what's your attitude, and what do you think we will have in the future for this kind of conflicts? For example, Turkey have built many dams, and maybe now Iraq or Syria, they don't have a very extreme issue, but in the future they will encounter many issues. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I've said, I do believe the political challenges are among the most difficult. Iran and Afghanistan actually have an agreement on the Helmand River, but drought in recent years has cut flows on the Helmand River, and there have been actually violent conflicts at the border between Iran and Afghanistan over the Helmand. And so figuring out how to strengthen that agreement is part of the challenge. But it's not just political, it's also ultimately going to be water management and the way we choose to use our water resources and the way climate change affects drought frequency and intensity. On the Tigris and the Euphrates, the dams that Turkey has built upstream of Syria and upstream of Iraq are affecting the flows. They're affecting the timing and they're affecting the amount of flows. And there's sort of an informal agreement between Turkey and Syria about the flow that's required to be delivered by Turkey to the Syrian border. But over time, Turkish agriculture is going to reduce flows in the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that's going to be a challenge. And I think before we get to the point where there's actual conflict, we have to come to agreement about how to share equitably water that crosses these political borders. How to grow more food with less water will permit us to keep water in systems that now have too little water. Better drought management and understanding of how climate change is going to affect the frequency and intensity of droughts might help us deal with droughts before they become too severe. So it's a technology question, it's a politics question, it's an institutional question, it's all of those things that we've already been discussing.
Okay, very good. One of our other students recently wrote a paper which is about saltwater intrusion. Manan, who's here, Manan Surapriya, I think he might have some audio problem right now. But, there are, and we have a whole program in Delaware monitoring saltwater intrusion. So his question is about, what are possibilities for some kind of systemic solutions to saltwater intrusion as a problem?
Yeah, so of course, saltwater intrusion is a result of overpumping groundwater at the coastal areas, and saltwater then intrudes into the aquifer, or sea level rise, which contributes to saltwater intrusion in coastal aquifers. And we have this problem in California as well. And interestingly, one of the solutions to the saltwater intrusion problem in Southern California, which was a very serious problem in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, because of overdraft of groundwater from these coastal aquifers for urban use, was wastewater treatment and reuse. We built something called the Orange County Groundwater Replenishment District that collected wastewater, treated it to a very high standard, and then injected it into coastal groundwater aquifers for two purposes. One, to prevent saltwater intrusion, and the other, to provide a source of fresh water for urban use. And it's been incredibly successful. The Orange County water treatment plant is one of the largest in the world for water treatment and reuse. The groundwater replenishment district was set up to deal with the saltwater intrusion problem, and saltwater intrusion has been slowed very dramatically in this area. So thinking about how to reduce withdrawals of groundwater from coastal aquifers that are vulnerable, figuring out how to recharge those aquifers, perhaps with highly treated wastewater that can then be reused for human purposes, are two of the strategies that I think are most important.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, any other questions from the floor? I don't know if I'm missing something because we have two separate screens. But this is a very valuable opportunity, so students especially, but also others. We have several faculty here as well. And okay, I've got one question separately sent to me here, which is about we've had a project on peace agreements. Like we were looking at, this was actually the Harvard Kennedy School, looking at a range of peace agreements and looking at what worked and what didn't work. So going back to the soft path, can you give examples of what worked? Like in terms of, we've looked at the problem cases, but are there examples of what actually worked in a water
Sure.
peace agreement?
So, well, of course, the 1960 Indus River Treaty that you mentioned between Pakistan and India on the Indus was brokered in large part, I think, by the World Bank. And has it been completely successful? No, but it absolutely has been a model for at least setting up some of the institutional requirements and the political agreements to help reduce tensions to some degree over river basins. The Colorado River Treaty in 1944 has been a very successful example, and we have an agreement with Canada as well over the Great Lakes about how to share and manage the Great Lakes, which are shared by the US and Canada. And they work in part because our institutions are working reasonably well, but in part because we have conflict resolution mechanisms. Israel and Jordan have an agreement about the Jordan River, which is shared by Israel and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and the West Palestinians in the West Bank. And for the Jordan agreement, Jordan delivers water in the Yarmouk River to Israel in the north, and Israel delivers water to Jordan in the south. There's a conflict resolution mechanism. It's been relatively successful. It does not adequately, of course, include the Palestinians, which has been a very serious and continuing source of conflict. So that would not be a successful example. And I like the UN agreement, the transboundary agreement that set principles for sharing transboundary water resources and setting principles about equitable sharing and about allocation of water and about conflict resolution and about data sharing. Those are some examples, but there are other examples in my book about successful strategies for sustainably managing water resources. This is actually sort of maybe this is a good way to close, but one of the reasons that I'm optimistic about the future is I see success stories in all of these areas, in efficiency, in alternative sources of supply, in politics, in economics, in the human right to water. The challenge is to understand those success stories and to scale them up to help this third age of water come about faster.
Indeed, yep. No, that's always with these kinds of efforts is that you use the case study and then you see how it can be adapted to a much broader context. And both from an academic point of view, we talk about inductive research and then broader applicability, which we always try to teach our students. So thank you so much, Dr. Gleick, for taking the time and sharing your wisdom and insights. We will put this also on our YouTube channel so that we can have longer kind of coverage of your ideas there. And certainly I would encourage everyone to read the book. And it is really going to be a classic, I'm sure, moving forward for many years to come. And we will, just as Del Levia used your other book, I'm sure we would be using this book also. I should mention we have a PhD program also in water science and policy, which is an interdepartmental program, and not many of those around. And so I have also suggested that all of the incoming students to that program be given your book for reading. So thank you again, and I do hope our paths will cross in person. If you're in on the East Coast, we're very centrally located, midway between Washington and New York, only 35 minutes from Philadelphia. So I really hope we will be able to meet in person at some point too. Thank you all
Well,
for joining.
thank you, Professor Ali, for having me on. The questions were great, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. Thank you.
Wonderful. All the best. Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you.